There is an uncomfortable truth I have discovered after observing people over the years. Not all dreams die from a lack of ability. Many die from an excess of words. I remember a situation in Japan when a friend told me about his big project with so much enthusiasm, only to abandon it weeks later. I wondered what had changed. It wasn't the project. It was the disclosure. Today I want to talk about something that can change your destiny. The 4 things you should never tell anyone. Because sometimes silence is not an absence of voice, but a strategy for life. Listen until the end. Silence is not something natural for most people because from an early age, we learn to talk, to explain, to justify, and to narrate everything we do as if that gave our existence value. Yet over time, I discovered something very interesting as I observed different environments. Those who talk the most do not always make the greatest progress. In fact, it is often exactly the opposite. I remember a very simple scene in Japan. I was standing at a train station, watching a group of workers. They barely spoke to one another, only what was strictly necessary. Each person knew exactly what they had to do and carried out their tasks with an almost soundless precision. There was no need to explain every step or to comment on what they would accomplish afterward. They simply did it. Something struck me in that moment. While people in other places waste energy talking about what they are going to do, there the energy was used to actually do it. Over time, I came to understand that silence is not an absence of communication, but a superior form of concentration. When you talk too much, your mind begins to scatter. It is as though every word is a small energy leak. You say what you are going to do, you picture it as already accomplished, you receive opinions, criticism, perhaps even premature applause, and without noticing it, your brain begins to believe that you have already made progress, even though you have done nothing yet. When you stay silent instead, something different happens. The mind focuses, the goal stops being social, and turns inward. You're no longer working to be seen by others, you're working to be at peace with yourself. And that difference, as small as it may seem, completely changes the outcome. I have witnessed people with big dreams who lose momentum every time they talk about them. They start hearing sentences like, "That's difficult, I don't think it's possible." Or even, "Interesting," but with an energy that doesn't help. And although it seems harmless, these words circle inside the mind. Step by step, they replace conviction with doubt. That is why the discipline of silence is not a punishment, but a form of protection. It is the conscious decision not to invest one's own energy into unnecessary conversations. It means learning to live with one's own goals without needing external validation. It means understanding that what you are building is so valuable that it requires no audience before it is finished. Even in my own experience, I have noticed that the times of greatest growth were not the loudest ones, but the quietest. Moments in which I did not explain what I was going to do, in which I did not seek approval, in which I simply focused on moving forward, step by step, without announcing anything. It is strange, but in that silence you do not feel alone, you feel stronger. The silence forces you to be honest with yourself. You can no longer hide behind beautiful words. All that remains is action. And acting in silence is far more powerful because it has no emotional distractions. In the end, silence takes nothing from you. It gives back everything you unconsciously lose: focus, clarity, and control over your own path. And once you understand that, you stop talking to convince others and you begin living to convince yourself. There is a very common mistake that most people make when they get excited about their goals. They talk before they act, and they do it with good intentions, believing that sharing their plans will make them more real, more powerful, and more possible. Yet over time I have observed something completely different. The more people talk, the less they actually get done. I remember a conversation with a young man in Japan who wanted to start his own business. He had everything figured out in his head. He had even thought through the name, the logo, the colors, and the way it would change his life. He spoke for almost an hour about his project with impressive energy, but when I saw him again months later, he hadn't even started. Not because he couldn't, but because a part of him felt as though he already had. He had experienced his success in words, not in actions. And that is the greatest danger in telling your plans before carrying them out. The mind confuses intention with reality. When you talk too much, you get a small dose of emotional satisfaction. People listen to you, applaud, say it's a great idea, and that creates an illusion of progress. But in reality, you haven't moved a single step forward. Furthermore, when you reveal your plans, you expose them to other people's interpretation, and not everyone will see what you see. Some will say it's difficult, others that it's not the right time, and others that they already tried and failed. And even though you believe it doesn't affect you, those words begin working quietly inside your head. You start to doubt, to procrastinate, to adjust your dream to make it seem more realistic, and without even noticing, it shrinks. I have observed this many times in different countries. The most persistent people are not those who talk the most, but those who explain the least. They simply work. They don't need to convince anyone of what they're doing because they're too busy building it. Even in Japanese culture, there is a very clear notion. First prove, then speak, not the other way around. Because when something is already done, no one can question it, but when it exists only in words, anyone can destroy it. I have also experienced the opposite. People who announce big changes in their life. I'm going to train every day, I'm going to start a company, I'm going to completely transform myself. And for a few days, they feel energy, but then that energy drops off because the brain has already received recognition without having delivered results. It is as if the effort has already been partially redeemed. That is why withholding plans does not mean hiding them, but protecting them. It means preventing them from being contaminated by premature opinions, external expectations, or emotions that have no foundation yet. It means allowing the idea to grow in a safe space until it is strong enough to carry itself. When you begin to act in silence, something very powerful happens. Motivation stops depending on others. You no longer need to tell people what you are doing in order to feel committed. The commitment becomes internal, firm, nearly unshakable, and over time, you discover something that few people understand. Plans do not need to be announced in order to be real. They need to be worked on in order to become inevitable. There is something many people discover too late. Not all ears are ready to hear your problems. There is a very human tendency to seek relief in talking, to believe that we will automatically feel better if we say what we feel, and in some cases that is true. But in many others, the opposite happens. You end up feeling more confused, more vulnerable, and heavier than before. I remember a situation I observed in an everyday setting in Japan. A man was having difficulties at work and decided to tell several colleagues about it over lunch. What began as a simple emotional release developed into a general topic of conversation. By the next day, it was no longer just his internal problem, but a comment making the rounds in the workplace. And although no one had any ill intentions, his situation had lost its privacy, and with it, a part of his control. That made me understand something important. Personal problems don't just need a solution, they need protection. Because when you reveal them without careful thought, you are no longer the only one interpreting them. Now come opinions, judgments, comparisons, and advice that often don't align with your reality. I have seen many people weakened, not by what happened to them, but by the person they told it to. Because not everyone has the emotional maturity to handle what they hear. Some downplay your pain, others exaggerate it, and others turn it into something it isn't. And without even realizing it, you end up carrying not only your own problem, but also the interpretations of others. And there is something even more delicate. When you show your wounds to the wrong person, you give them information about your vulnerabilities, not because everyone will use it against you, but because what has been spoken, once said, can no longer be controlled. Words do not stay in one place. They move, they are repeated, they are distorted. In my experience, the people with the greatest emotional stability are not those who talk the most about their problems, but those who have learned to process them internally. First, they take the time to understand what they feel, to organize their thoughts, to separate emotion from reality before asking anyone for an external opinion. Because when you talk too soon, you risk developing a dependency. You begin to rely on what others think about your situation instead of trusting your own ability to resolve it, and little by little, without even realizing it, you give away control over your peace of mind. I have also noticed that many real solutions do not emerge in conversation, but in reflection. In those moments when no one is voicing an opinion, when there is no noise, when you can honestly listen to yourself, you begin to see options that you had not seen before. That is why it is not about suppressing what you feel or pretending that everything is fine. It is about carefully choosing who you grant access to your inner world, because not everyone is there to help you carry the burden. Some are only there to watch it. And when you understand that, you change your relationship with your problems. You stop carrying them outward and begin to face them from within. And in that process, you discover a form of strength that depends on no one else but you. There is something that very few people understand until they have gathered enough emotional experience. Your emotions are not suitable for everyone. Just as you would not grant every stranger access to your home, you should not grant every person access to your emotional world, because what you feel, what you think in your most vulnerable moments is a very intimate part of your identity. I remember how I once observed a conversation in an everyday setting in Japan. A person was enthusiastically sharing their fears, their insecurities and inner doubts. They did so sincerely, seeking understanding, but the reaction they received was not the one they had expected. It was not malice, it was incomprehension. Some people responded with uncomfortable silence, others with superficial comments, and others still with opinions that were of no help whatsoever. In that moment, I understood something important. Not all people have the emotional capacity to carry what you give them. Emotions are powerful, but also fragile when they are not well guarded. If you show them unfiltered, they become vulnerable to misinterpretation. What is deep pain for you may be nothing more than a light conversation for someone else. And that difference can influence far more than you can imagine. I have observed how many people lose emotional stability, not because of what they feel, but because of the way others react to what they feel. Because a wrong opinion at the wrong moment can sow doubt where clarity once existed. It can amplify a small fear. It can turn a temporary uncertainty into a permanent conviction. That is why protecting your emotions does not mean hiding them. It means managing them with intelligence, understanding that not everyone needs to know what you are feeling at every moment. It means giving yourself the time to process what you have experienced internally before seeking external validation. In everyday experience, I have noticed that the emotionally most stable people are not those who share the most, but those who are best at choosing what they share. They do not react impulsively to what they feel, but first understand it, organize it, analyze it in silence, and only then decide whether it is necessary to talk about it or not. It is also important to understand that not all people respond with the same sensitivity. Some can hear your emotions and respond maturely, but others may do so out of their own fear, insecurity, or lack of experience. And without realizing it, they end up projecting their own limitations onto your situation. When you allow everyone access to your emotional world, you lose control over how your inner story is interpreted, and that can weaken you without you even noticing, because you are not only carrying what you feel, but also how others see it. That is why genuine emotional protection is not withdrawal, but selection. It is about learning to distinguish between those who can contribute clarity and those who only generate noise. It is about developing the maturity not to share everything in the moment you feel it, but only when it is truly necessary. With time, you discover something valuable. When your emotions are protected, your mind becomes more stable. You are no longer dependent on external reactions to feel balanced. You begin to build an inner strength in which what you feel belongs to you. You are the first to understand it, and that gives you a degree of peace that cannot be bought or found in the opinions of others. And when you reach that point, you understand that protecting your emotions does not make you distant, but conscious. It does not make you cold, it makes you strong, and above all, it gives you back control over your inner world. There is a truth that few people learn in time. Premature success is fragile when it is revealed too early. In many cases, it is not failure that weakens a person, but the need to talk about it before it has solidified. And this happens more often than it seems. I remember a situation in Japan where a young man had achieved his first significant increase in income. He was excited, shared it with several people, and for a few days received congratulations, attention, and even a certain admiration. But a short time later, his attitude changed. He began to feel pressure, expectations, and comparisons. He no longer enjoyed his progress. Now he experienced it as an obligation toward others, and without realizing it, what had been an inner victory had become an outer burden. That made me understand something profound. When you talk about your successes too early, you stop experiencing them for yourself and begin experiencing them for the opinions of others. And that shift is very dangerous because it introduces something into your process that should not be there, external expectation. I have observed many people who begin to improve their financial situation, achieve small gains, new income, new opportunities, but instead of consolidating that growth quietly, they expose it openly, and in doing so, they attract reactions that are not always positive. Some compare them, others judge them, still others begin to expect things from them, and that invisible pressure starts to affect their stability. Because the reality is that not everyone responds well to the progress of others. Even if they don't say it directly, many people compare your growth to their own, and that comparison can generate envy, pressure, or even distance. Not because you have done anything wrong, but because success revealed too early awakens emotions in others that are not always healthy. In my experience, the most solid progress is not the most visible, but the most consistent. People who are truly building financial or professional stability generally do not talk too much about their initial earnings or achievements. They prefer to consolidate, understand, and stabilize them first before explaining anything to the outside world. I've also noticed something interesting. When you don't talk about what you're achieving, your relationship to that achievement changes. It's no longer about impressing others, but about maintaining it, improving it, letting it grow. The focus becomes internal, not external, and that difference completely transforms the quality of your decisions. When you share too early, you begin to seek approval. And when you seek approval, you begin to make decisions based on what others think, not based on what you truly need. And little by little, without even noticing, you lose emotional and strategic independence. That is why protecting your income and achievements means not hiding, but maturity. It means understanding that the true value of what you are building does not need to be validated the moment it happens. It needs to be consolidated until it is strong enough to speak for itself. Over time, you discover something liberating. The most solid success is the one that does not need to be explained. It is the one that is noticed without being announced, that holds itself without pressure, that grows without noise. And when you reach that level, you no longer need to tell others what you have because your life is already demonstrating it for you. There is a very clear difference between people who dream and people who build. And this difference lies not in what they say, but in what they do before they say it. In many cultures, intention is celebrated, but in the discipline I observed in Japan over the course of years, what matters is not what you announce, but what you have already done without any announcement. I remember a very simple experience at a company where something caught my attention and moved me deeply. A worker arrived earlier than everyone else, set up his workstation, reviewed his tasks, and began working without having to announce what he would be doing that day. There were no speeches, no promises, no unnecessary explanations, only action. And the most interesting thing was that his work spoke for itself at the end of the day. This stands in stark contrast to what I have seen in other places where people constantly have to communicate their intentions. I will do this, I will change that, I will start tomorrow. And while that sounds motivating, these words often consume the energy that should be directed toward action. I have noticed that when a person talks too much about what they are going to do, their mind begins to experience a false sense of progress. It is as though the mere act of saying it aloud gives them a small internal satisfaction, which is enough to reduce the urgency to act. And without realizing it, time passes and action is delayed. Japanese discipline teaches something different. First you act, then you speak if necessary, because when something is already done, it needs no explanation. The results speak for themselves, they generate no doubt. They do not depend on interpretation, they require no confirmation. I have also seen how this mentality changes a person's relationship with themselves. When you stop announcing your plans, you begin to observe your own behavior more honestly. There are no more external excuses, no more public expectations, just you and your commitment, and that forces you to be more accountable. In my experience, the most solid progress does not come from grand declarations, but from small actions repeated quietly. People who decided to change their lives, not because they announced it, but because they did it every day without saying a word. And over time, that quiet consistency transformed into visible results. There is something very powerful about not speaking before you act. You reduce unnecessary pressure. When you have promised nothing to the world, you do not have to justify your delays, explain your pauses, or defend your results. You simply keep going at your own pace without external interference. Over time, you come to understand that action carries a weight that words cannot replace. You can talk a great deal, but if you do nothing, everything remains empty. If, on the other hand, you speak little, act consistently, and your life eventually begins to speak for itself, it is in that moment that you discover the essence of this discipline. True strength lies not in what you announce to the world, but in what you build in silence until you no longer have anything left to say. There is something that many people only notice after they have already wasted too much energy. When you start seeking approval, you stop moving forward freely. External validation can seem like motivation at first, but over time it becomes a quiet dependency that drains your focus, your discipline, and your clarity. I remember a scene I observed in an everyday context in Japan. A young man was working on a personal project and constantly seeking the opinions of others. He would share every small bit of progress and wait for a positive reaction, a confirmation that he was on the right track. At first he received support, but over time his behavior began to change. He was no longer making decisions with his own self-confidence, but rather out of a need to please or impress. And without realizing it, his progress became slower, more uncertain, and more fragmented. That made me understand something important. When your motivation depends on the reactions of others, you lose control over your own pace. You no longer move forward because you believe in your path, but because you are waiting for an external signal to tell you that you are doing the right thing. And that kind of dependency is very costly on an emotional level. I have observed many people who begin with enthusiasm, but whose energy gradually fades because they are constantly paying attention to how others react. When they receive approval, they feel good. When they don't, they doubt themselves, and this constant fluctuation consumes an enormous amount of mental energy that should be directed toward action. External validation also changes the intention behind what you do. Instead of working to build something solid, you begin working to be seen, recognized, and accepted. And when the goal changes, the quality of the effort changes too. You are no longer building, you are trying to impress. In my experience, the most resilient people are not those who receive the most approval, but those who need it the least, because they have understood that security does not come from the outside, but from within. They need no one to tell them things are going well, because their daily progress is already proof enough. I have also noticed that the constant search for validation generates anxiety, because it is never enough. There is always a new opinion to anticipate, a new reaction to interpret, a new comparison to navigate, and that keeps the mind in a state of constant instability. When you stop seeking approval, something changes deep within you. You begin to work with more freedom, to make decisions with more clarity, to move forward without the pressure of being watched. And this freedom allows you to focus on what truly matters, the process. Over time, you discover that the most powerful energy is not the kind that comes from external recognition, but the kind that arises from inner conviction. This energy is not drained by the opinions of others. It does not depend on applause. It does not weaken in silence. It simply keeps moving forward. And in that moment, you understand something essential. When you stop seeking validation, you reclaim your energy. And when you reclaim your energy, you reclaim your life. There is an idea that completely changes the way a person protects their life. Not everyone who listens to you is capable of understanding you. And although that sounds harsh, not everyone deserves access to your inner world, because what you carry within you is not casual information. It is a part of your emotional, mental, and spiritual construction. I remember a situation I observed in Japan during a conversation among colleagues. One person decided to share something very personal about their fears and decisions. They did it sincerely, believing they were in a safe environment. But what was interesting was the group's reaction. Not everyone knew how to handle that information. Some responded with discomfort, others with light-hearted comments, and others simply changed the subject. And in that moment, it became clear that the intention to share does not always align with the readiness to receive. I have observed this in many different contexts. People open up their inner world and expect understanding, but not everyone has the emotional maturity, the experience, or the sensitivity to respond appropriately. And when that happens, what was once an intimate space becomes a source of confusion or even vulnerability. Your inner world consists of your deepest thoughts, your fears, your decisions, your doubts, your personal processes. It is not a public space, it is a space of construction. And like everything valuable, it needs protection. Because when too many people have access to it, you lose the clarity of what is truly yours and what is external influence. In my experience, I have noticed that the emotionally most stable people are not those who share everything with everyone, but those who filter with wisdom. It is not about closing yourself off from the world, but about understanding that not everyone contributes equally to your inner process. I have also observed something important. When you share your inner world too freely with the wrong people, you begin to fragment yourself. Every external opinion becomes an additional layer over your thoughts, and instead of hearing yourself clearly, you begin to hear echoes. And these echoes often do not reflect your reality, but rather someone else's interpretation of your reality. Protecting your inner world does not mean distrusting everyone. It means having criteria. It means knowing that certain conversations require emotional maturity from both sides. Because what matters is not only what you say, but also what the other person does with what they hear. I have also seen that when a person learns to keep their inner world in reserve, their mind becomes clearer. They begin to make decisions with less noise, with more certainty, with more direction. They no longer live reactively to external opinions, but act from a deeper understanding of themselves. Over time, you discover something very powerful. You don't need everyone to understand you. You only need to understand yourself first. And when you have inner clarity, external opinions lose their emotional weight, and then everything changes. Because you begin to build a life in which your inner world is not an open space but a protected place, strong and guided by yourself. There is a truth that many people find uncomfortable when they first hear it. Real growth is almost never visible while it is happening. It is not applauded, not celebrated, not commented on. It happens in silence, in moments when no one is watching, and that is precisely why it carries so much power. I remember a very simple experience I observed in everyday Japanese life. There were people who came to work early, practiced their skills, repeated tasks with precision and improved step by step without anyone needing to watch them. There were no cameras, no constant recognition, no external expectations, only discipline. And over time, these small, invisible efforts transformed into visible results. That made me understand something fundamental. Real growth doesn't need an audience. In fact, the presence of an audience often interrupts it, because when you know someone is watching, your focus shifts. You start worrying about how your progress looks instead of how it feels on the inside. I have observed many people who want to improve their lives but feel compelled to share every single step. When they go to the gym, they post about it. When they start a project, they announce it. When they try to change a habit, they comment on it. And while there is nothing wrong with sharing things, the problem arises when growth depends on being seen, because at that point you are no longer growing for yourself, but for others. Real growth is uncomfortable, repetitive, and often boring. It doesn't have epic moments every day. It consists of failed attempts, quiet adjustments, days when nobody notices any difference. And it is precisely on those days that true transformation takes place. In my experience, the people who make the most progress are not those who seek the most attention, but those who embrace the invisible process. They are able to work without immediate recognition, without constant approval, without the need for witnesses. And this ability makes them mentally stronger because their motivation does not depend on external factors. I also noticed something interesting. When no one is watching, discipline becomes purer. There is no longer any superficial motivation, no social pressure, only inner commitment. And it is this kind of commitment that sustains real change over the long term. The problem with growing in front of witnesses is that you often begin to measure your own progress by the reactions of others. If nobody notices, it feels like you aren't moving forward. If there are no comments, you start doubting your own process, and this external dependency weakens your consistency. But when you accept that growth happens in silence, everything changes. You focus on repetition, daily improvement, the inner process. You no longer need anyone to validate your effort because you already know what you are building. Over time, you discover something very powerful. What no one sees is exactly what transforms you the most, because that is precisely where you develop discipline, character, and emotional resilience. And when the results finally become visible, they are not the beginning of the process, but the consequence of everything you did when no one was watching. There is a phase in life when you believe you have to explain everything in order to be understood, to explain what you do, to justify what you are building, to announce what is coming. But with time, you discover something far more powerful. You no longer need to talk as much when your own results start speaking for you. I remember a very simple experience observing the behavior of people in Japan. There were individuals who didn't talk too much about their goals, their plans, or their daily efforts. Yet over time, their results were plain to see. Their stability, their discipline, their way of working said far more than any explanation they could have given. And the most interesting thing was that they didn't need to convince anyone. That made me understand something important. When you talk less and do more, your own life begins to build a narrative that cannot be ignored. Words are interpretations, but results are facts, and facts need no defense. I have observed many people who try to build credibility through talking, but over time come to realize that real credibility is not built through talking, but through consistency, because you can explain your intentions, but you cannot fake results that have been maintained over time. I've also noticed something peculiar. When a person talks too much about what they're doing, they unconsciously begin to feel as though they've already made progress, as if the mere act of telling gives them a kind of premature satisfaction. But when you choose to stay silent, the opposite happens. The internal pressure builds. There are no more external distractions, only engagement with yourself. In my experience, the most transformative moments were not the loudest, but the quietest. Moments in which there was no need for approval, recognition, or explanation, the only consistent action. And over time, that action began to produce a visible change in life. People often underestimate the power of silence. They think that silence means hiding or having nothing to say. But in reality, strategic silence is a form of maturity. It means understanding that not everything needs to be shared the moment it happens. Some things need time to solidify before they are revealed. When your life begins to speak for you, something changes in the way you relate to the world. You no longer try to convince, no longer justify, no longer ask for approval. You simply keep moving forward, and that creates a different presence, more solid, more calm, more certain. I have observed that the most respected people are not necessarily those who talk the most, but those who have built something so enduring that they no longer need to explain it. Their life becomes sufficient proof, and that is precisely where true change takes place. When you understand that your silence does not take away your worth, but multiplies it, because while others are explaining what they want to do, you are building what will ultimately need no explanation at all. In the end, you discover something liberating. When you stop talking so much, your life begins to speak for you, and it does so far more powerfully than any word ever could. At the end of all this, there is a lesson that is impossible to ignore. Life is not built with words, but with quiet decisions that are repeated every day. And many people believe they need to announce what they are going to do in order to make it real, but over time you discover the opposite. What truly changes your life is not what you say, but what you can sustain when no one is listening. When you look back, you will probably see moments when talking too much took away your focus, when seeking approval drained your energy, or when revealing your plans too openly weakened your momentum. And not because talking is bad, but because when you do it too early, you give away something that is still under construction. You give the world something that was not yet strong enough. The discipline of silence is not withdrawal, it is intelligence. It is about learning what is worth sharing and what must mature in private. It means understanding that not everyone needs to know what you are building for it to grow. In fact, many of the most valuable things in life develop far away from the eyes of others. When you apply this principle, something changes within you. You begin to move with more clarity, more control, more intention. You are no longer dependent on the reactions of others to confirm your path. Your motivation becomes internal, firm, stable, and it is this stability that allows you to move forward even when no one is watching. In the end, it is not about living in absolute silence, but about learning not to waste your own energy on what is not yet finished. It is about letting your actions speak first and allowing the words to follow afterward when they can no longer be called into question. And when that moment comes, you will recognize something powerful. You did not need to say very much to get this far. Your discipline did it for you, your consistency built it, and your silence protected it until the end.